Hello everybody. My name is Arpan and I'm a student of grade 8 AM. And today we are going to be looking at a topic which is namely Dalai Lama and the China conflict. So, first of all, for those who don't know who is the current Dalai Lama, he's the 14th Dalai Lama, and we are going to look at him in a short glimpse in our further slides. So we are going to look at this conflict, what were the backgrounds, and we are going to go through all the topics, and we are going to in a nutshell, we are going to study the whole conflict. So first of all, we must know who is Dalai Lama. So Dalai Lama is a term or title conferred to the foremost spiritual leader of the Gelug or the Yellow Hat school of Buddhism. Now, as I said earlier, also that the Dalai Lama is a term or title conferred to the foremost spiritual leader of the Gelug or Yellow Hat school of Buddhism. So, in this case, what we're talking about is a spiritual leader. Now, we must know who a spiritual leader is. So, a spiritual leader is a kind of a leader who basically activates our inner spirit, and moreover he is a kind of motivator for us. For example, we have Sadhguru in India, we have multiple foreign personalities as well, like Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, who post online motivation videos regarding fitness and spirituality. So Dalai Lama is the foremost spiritual leader of the or the main person who is the leader of the Yellow Hat school of Buddhism, which is commonly known as Jalag or Gelag, depending upon the pronunciation. So in a way to remember this point, you can simply open up the picture of Dalai Lama, and you are going to see this yellow color here. So this yellow color represents Yellow Hat school of Buddhism. So if you ever forget the name, so just remember this yellow band of garment here. So the 14th Dalai Lama is Tenzin Gyatso. He was born in a village called Taktser in northeastern Tibet. So he's the 14th Dalai Lama, or the 14th foremost spiritual leader of the Jalak or Yellow Hat school of Buddhism. So Buddhism, we all know that it's a religion that was started in the Indian subcontinent. So and for a fact, it's said that the eight main religions in the world, namely Sikhism, Hinduism, and all, and some other religions, they were started in India. So India is also an educational as well as a religious hub of knowledge. So now his real name is not known, but his religious name is Tenzin Gyatso. Until now, all the Dalai Lamas of the Jalag or Yellow Hat school of Buddhism, they all have this surname Gyatso. So moving ahead, he was born in a village called Taksir in northeastern Tibet. Now, northeastern Tibet is the northeastern part of Tibet, and there we have a village namely Taksir, where he was born as a 14th Dalai Lama. So he is the current and the 14th Dalai Lama. We have covered all these 3 points. I hope these are clear to you. So moving ahead. Now, what is this conflict between Dalai Lama and the Chinese government? So, the conflict has its roots back in 1950 with the Chinese intervention in Tibetan culture and the Chinese intervention in Tibetan politics. Now, wherever there is, as in it has been a very big habit of a lot of nations, that wherever there is some contradicting culture or there is some contradicting politics going on, a lot of intervention can be found, and mostly through communist nations like Russia and China. So these types of nations, mainly communist nations, they have a habit of interfering in other politics of other nations. So this began in 1950, the starting of the tyranny of the two communities over each other. This was followed by the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Now China has now invaded Tibet. Now this is where everything would start. So the Chinese government immensely pressurized the Tibet to sign a 17-point agreement to gain supreme authority over Tibet. Now the Chinese government or the communist government Mao Zedong in that time, Mao Zedong mainly 1893 to 1976, he was in China as the leader of China. So he basically he and the Chinese government, they together pressurized the Tibetans to sign a 17-point agreement to gain supreme authority over Tibet. Now, supreme authority can be replaced with a word, namely sovereignty over Tibet. So, what does this supreme authority mean here? This supreme authority means that the Chinese government would have control on Tibet's economy, Tibet's law, Tibet's constitution, Tibetan culture, Tibetan monopoly, everything. But the process did not go as said. The Tibetans rebelled with full spirit to drive out the Chinese. Even though they weren't successful in driving them out in Tibet, it has now been annexed by the Chinese government. But the process was also not smooth. One way of telling this is through this picture here, where a Tibetan girl is being executed by the by two Chinese soldiers. She is going to be shot, and this is the picture when in 1950 China invaded Tibet. So, but the Tibetans also said that that they won't let Chinese into their land. So the same thing can be found in India also, the Birsa Munda movement, and we are going to cover it in our next chapter also. So what were the outcomes of this invasion? So on March 10th, 1959, violent riots broke out in Lhasa. The Tibetans were disturbed and expressed their dissatisfaction openly. This was a sign that the Tibetans would openly come out if their rights if they were violated. On 10th March 1959, a violent riot basically broke out in Lhasa, which is the capital of Tibet. So the Tibetans, they were really dissatisfied, and they didn't like this much bloodshed in their valley and on their land. So they basically expressed their dissatisfaction openly in order to drive out the Chinese. As I earlier also said, that they didn't want Chinese or any foreigner on their land. So they so what were the reasons of this rebellion? We are going to cover these reasons in the next upcoming slides. So they said that if their rights were violated, then they are going to surely rebel and openly come out to the international community. So Beijing quickly reacted, and within a few weeks, important figures, religious leaders, and important politicians were abducted, tortured, and killed in Chinese prison camps. Now, as I used the word bloodshed earlier, we have bloodshed now. That the capital of China, which is Beijing, it has most of its headquarters. The Chinese military and all its government, it had most of its headquarters in Beijing. So within a few weeks, important figures and religious leaders, they were started to getting kidnapped. They were tortured and they were killed in order to spill out the secrets of the Tibetans. So this was basically a call to all the Tibetan civilians that if they continue to rebel, then important figures and religious leaders would be abducted. Now, as I said, that the Tibetan army at that time wasn't big, and numerically speaking, at that time, the Chinese Liberal Army or the Communist Army was very, very big. So they quickly set up Chinese prison camps, and then there the people were abducted, tortured, and killed in these Chinese prison camps, either by shooting or by various torture methods. So the international committee stood by and they supported Dalai Lama, and then the 23-year-old 14th Dalai Lama fled to India along with his followers. Now this is a 23-year-old Dalai Lama, you can see. So at this time he was the 14th Dalai Lama, and he fled to India with his followers. Now, why did he come to India? He came to India because he didn't have any other ally at that time, and the closest nation to Tibet was India. So he fled to Dharamshala, somewhere in Himachal Pradesh. So there he came to Dharamshala along with his followers, and since then he has been living in India as a refugee. So what did the Chinese basically do in Tibet is that people basically started fleeing the nation. So the Chinese brought multiple torture techniques with them. The Tibetans were devastated and some physically or mentally impaired for times to come. Now, as I said also, that Chinese were masters at that time in multiple torture techniques like electrocution or basically cutting off parts. So Tibetans were subject to this much so much violence that they couldn't bear all this, and because of that they were mentally and physically impaired for times to come. Some of them which were relieved, they were mentally and physically impaired for times to come, as in some were mentally ill and some were physically impaired, some lost their vision, some lost their limbs. So the worst part was it when it came to women. The Tibetan women were raped, sterilized, and were forced to abort babies. Now you can clearly see here that the Tibetan women, their dignity was not being their dignity was not being respected by the Chinese army. So what they did is they raped women, sterilized, and they were forced to abort or basically kill their babies. So assassinations, killings, rape, murders everywhere. This was devastating since the valley had never seen bloodshed. So, as I said earlier, also that Tibet has been a very peaceful place, and this was the reason that they didn't like foreigners on their land. So, assassinations, killing, rapes, and murders everywhere were very new to them. So they didn't know how to. Uh, they didn't know how to cope up with it. Now, all these points are point one and two are very interrelated to each other. Since more and more assassinations, killing, rapes, and murders, more and more stress on our mental and physical needs of a human. The valley had never really seen this much bloodshed for times to come. So, continuing now, the Beijing was now fed up with the uprisings, and now the dark past, which would leave the Tibetans devastated for life, would begin. The matters were escalated, and now Beijing dispatched a notice to the Liberal Army. The notice mentioned that the army had the right to suppress Tibetans. The army began pressurizing civilians to not follow their culture. Tibetans were not allowed to wear traditional clothes, monasteries and temples were closed, religious gatherings and festivals were banned. Now we can see that the Chinese government, the Maoist government, it was, you can clearly see the amount of tyranny going on. So what basically happened is that because of the uprisings, Beijing was completely angry and was like it was literally fed up of the uprisings. Now the dark age of Tibet would begin, where the matters would even escalate that the Tibetan governors and the Tibetan officials could not handle it anymore. Beijing dispatched now a notice to the army. The notice mentioned that the army had the right to suppress Tibetans. Till now, their rights were not being violated in a way, but the notice dispatched acted as a fire, a skyrocket, which basically meant that the Tibetans would not be respected anymore, the amount of dignity to be given to them. So the army began pressurizing civilians to not follow their culture. The Tibetans were not allowed to wear traditional clothes, monasteries and temples were closed, religious gatherings and festivals were banned. Now the army, what it began is that it began closing stores and their basic livelihood, which was agriculture. Monasteries and temples also acted as a very big livelihood source of income, since Tibet, as I said also, that Tibet is a very peaceful nation, so religion would be a very big source of income there. So traditional clothes which Tibetans like in the picture here, which Tibetans like normally wear, they were not allowed to wear while walking on the roads. So this they have basically taken away the right to freedom as mentioned in the Indian Constitution. Monasteries and temples were closed. Again, the right to freedom and the right to interpretation has been violated here. Religious gatherings and festivals were banned since the Chinese government wanted to suppress the Tibetans. Now again, religious rights and again the right to freedom has been violated here. So we can see that the Chinese army or the liberal army or the communist army, They have basically violated so many rights here, and these are all humanitarian rights which were violated. And before the matter could reach the UN, the international community stood up for the Dalai Lama, and the matters were now, there was a lot of time for it to think. So continuing now, this is the 17-point agreement which I was talking about here. Now this is the 17-point agreement. This is Mandarin or Chinese. You can count them if you want. These are all 17 points, and there are multiple Tibetan stamps here. So thanking you. Now I'm really happy that all of you listened to this presentation with a lot of patience. So yeah, that is all for this presentation, and I hope that you have understood it to your greatest extent. So yeah, that's all. Thank you. Good evening.